On the map, it does not look hidden. A dot moves across the sea, an oil tanker with a name, a flag, and a route. So if ships like this can be followed, why does the oil still move? That is the contradiction at the center of Russia's shadow fleet. The name makes it sound invisible, as if the ships simply disappear into the ocean. But many of them can still be seen. Analysts track them. Governments know the system exists. Some vessels have even been sanctioned directly. And still, Russian oil keeps moving. The real mystery is not simply where these ships are. It is why seeing them does not automatically stop them. The Shadow Fleet is not only a story about hiding ships on the ocean. It is a story about the gap between tracking a vessel and controlling the trade around it. And that starts with the sanctions themselves, because they were never meant to be a full blockade. That distinction became important after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when Western governments tried to cut into one of Moscow's most important sources of income, oil. But oil was not a simple target. Russia depended on it for revenue, while the global market still relied on its supply. If too much Russian oil disappeared too quickly, prices could rise, hurting consumers far beyond Russia, and potentially letting Moscow earn more from the oil it still managed to sell. So the goal was not simply to stop every barrel. The goal was to make Russia earn less. That is why the price cap was built as a compromise. Russian oil could still move, but if it wanted to access Western-linked services, it had to move under a maximum price. That mattered because an oil tanker is not just a ship on a route. It sits inside the support system, insurance, financing, paperwork, and companies willing to handle the cargo. Much of that system was tied to Western-linked firms, so avoiding the cap was not as simple as choosing another route on the map. This was not a full blockade. The route could remain open while the support system became conditional. And that is where the unintended consequence started to take shape. The Shadow Fleet was not an intended effect of the sanctions. It was the workaround that grew from the pressure they created. If Russia wanted to keep moving oil outside the normal system, it needed ships that could move with less dependence on the Western-linked services behind normal tanker trade. That pressure led to the second-hand tanker market. Before the price cap, many aging oil tankers were nearing the end of their most useful years. After the price cap, they became more valuable. Russia still needed to move oil, and many established companies were trying to avoid the trade. Older tankers were cheaper, already built, and available much faster than any new ship could be constructed. Reuters reported that aging oil tankers were being sold at record prices to new buyers in the Middle East and Asia, because ships willing to carry Russian oil to India and China could earn much higher rates. Reuters also pointed to Fractal Shipping, a Geneva-based manager handling 23 Dubai-owned oil and fuel tankers, most linked by ship tracking data to Russian crude routes from the Baltic and Black Sea to Asia. It was an example of a wider shift. Older ships were finding a new market in Russian oil. By February 2026, KSC Institute counted 109 unique tankers used to export Russian crude oil. 72% were classified as Shadow Fleet vessels, and among the Shadow crude tankers, 96% were older than 15 years. The workaround was no longer just a policy problem. It now had a physical shape. Older tankers pulled into a trade that needed to operate outside the usual system. But a tanker is only the visible part of the workaround. On a tracking map, an oil tanker looks simple. It has a name, a flag, a position, and a route. But behind that object is another identity, an owner, a manager, a flag state, and companies connected to the cargo. Those names can sit in different countries under different rules and change over time. One example is the oil tanker Mikadi, As reporting based on Windward data, Mikadi shows how many details around one ship can shift. Its name changed. It was sold to an anonymous owner. Its AIS signal went dark at times, and its flag changed to Sierra Leone. Then, after the EU listed the ship, the details shifted again. The owner and the manager listed around it changed from Azerbaijan to Samoa. None of this makes the ship impossible to identify. A new name does not erase the hull. A new flag does not erase the route. But it does make the responsibility harder to freeze in place, because suspicion alone is not always enough to stop a moving ship. It has to become proof that points to someone authorities can actually act against, and that takes time. And time is exactly what this kind of reshuffling creates. The ship stays visible, but the responsibility behind it keeps changing. That shifting responsibility would matter less if the cargo had nowhere to go. But Russian oil still has buyers. A voyage does not need everyone to trust the whole story behind it. It needs enough acceptance along the way. Workable papers, a good enough guarantee, port access, and a buyer still willing to take the oil. After Europe moved away from much of Russia's seaborne oil, India became one of the major destinations for Russian crude. For a refinery, discounted crude is oil that can be processed, turned into fuel, and sold. So even when the route becomes harder, the incentive does not disappear. In September 2025, Reuters reported on the sanctioned oil tanker Noble Walker. It was carrying about 1 million barrels of Russian crude for Indian refiner HPCL Mittal Energy and had been heading toward Mundra. Then, Adani Group barred vessels sanctioned by the EU, Britain, or the United States from its ports. Noble Walker changed course towards Wadi Nar instead. One port closed, the route bent, and the cargo kept moving. Sometimes the workaround happens at sea. The Financial Times reported on Russian oil shipped from the Arctic Russian port of Murmansk towards the Gulf of Oman. According to that reporting, the oil was carried most of the way on US blacklisted vessels, then transferred ship to ship onto another tanker named Samanda for the final leg to India. Ship-to-ship transfers are not illegal by themselves. They are a normal part of maritime trade, but in this context, they can change who appears to handle the next part of the journey. Oil can leave one ship with one paper trail and continue on another with a different route, operator, or sanctions profile. The cargo has not disappeared. It continues under a different set of names. That is what makes the Shadow Fleet difficult to pin down. Not invisibility, but adaptation. The system does not need one perfect path. It only needs the next usable opening. But that leaves the hardest question. If the ships are known, why not simply stop them? In 2026, Reuters found that after the UK threatened tougher actions against Russian-linked Shadow Fleet vessels, at least 98 Russian vessels subject to UK sanctions still crossed the UK waters in the following month. They were not invisible. They were not unknown. Yet, they still passed. Because visibility is not control. Sanctions are not a wall across the sea. A listed ship does not automatically turn around when it appears on a tracking screen. To stop it, authorities need a legal basis, a place where they can act, and a willingness to accept the risk of intervening. In April 2025, Estonia detained and boarded the Russian-bound tanker Kiwala. The ship was on the EU sanctions list, and Estonian authorities said it had no valid flag state. That gave them something concrete to act on. But a month later, Estonia tried to stop another Russian-bound tanker, Jaguar. According to Estonia, Russia sent a fighter jet during the attempt, briefly entering NATO airspace. The tanker was eventually escorted towards Russian waters. So stopping a vessel is not the same as identifying it on a tracking screen. It can mean boarding a ship, challenging its papers, proving the case, and risking a confrontation. And even when one ship is stopped, the trade behind it does not disappear. If the cargo still has value, if the buyer is still waiting, and if another vessel can be found, the system can bend around the loss. Stopping ships can delay cargoes, raise costs, and force new routes. But it does not automatically end the network behind them. Sanctions can close doors. The Shadow Fleet survives by finding the next one. And every new opening carries risk with it. That risk grows as the trade moves further from the system that normally makes the shipping easier to inspect. And that matters when something goes wrong. In January 2025, the oil tanker Aventine went adrift near the German island of Rügen. After leaving Russia with around 99,000 tons of oil on board, a German tug brought it under control. There was no spill, no disaster. But the warning was there. For a moment, the Shadow Fleet was no longer a sanctions problem, a paper trail, or a dot moving across the map. It was a real ship, carrying real oil, close enough for the danger to become visible. Because if one of these ships fails, the damage will not stay inside the paperwork, it will be in the water. And then, the question was no longer only how the ship was allowed to keep moving, it was who will be left to answer for it. The Shadow Fleet can blur ownership, bend routes, and move through the gaps, but it cannot make the risk disappear. And as long as Russia keeps pushing oil through this system, that risk keeps moving too, with every voyage carrying the chance that the workaround becomes an environmental disaster.